Number 1.
David Stone was a 29-year-old successful stock market analyst from La Jolla, California, who was deep into the New Age movement as he sought spiritual guidance. For years, he had struggled with control and anger issues, which seemed to come to a head on October 28, 1988. That day, he held a party at his apartment when he got into an argument with one of his friends. He then began attacking him, hitting him repeatedly. After this violent outburst, David told his friends and family about his behavior and said he ought to go on a walkabout to reflect on his conduct. He said he would return in a few days. According to Deputy Sheriff Bill Cavalier, the investigating officer, on the morning of Halloween 1988, he walked into the desert, 145 miles east of Tucson, Arizona. At around dawn, a farmer spotted him walking along a dirt road. The farmer briefly chatted with him, as it was seldom he saw tourists in this remote part of New Mexico. David told him that he was looking for the beast. Throughout the day, several local residents had seen him around the desert. He was acting strangely, talking to himself, and walking through rough terrain. 5 days later, his car was found abandoned along a desolate stretch of New Mexico Highway 80, 14 miles south of Road Forks, New Mexico. David's family believes that he went on a vision quest, which is common among people in the New Age movement. In this quest, the person goes on a journey to learn more about him or herself. It was discovered that David had left several mysterious clues after he vanished. They appeared to relate to the New Age movement. First, he had left his car near pyramid-shaped mountains, and pyramids were important symbols in the movement. As a search for him began, his trail headed northwest from his car toward Granite Peak. Searchers found a pyramid of rocks surrounded by a triangle. On the next day of searching, another pyramid was found, and next to it was David's watch and 2 quarters. 3 miles to the north, searchers found a string of numbers written in the sand. They realized they were Fibonacci ones, which are often used by engineers and stock market analysts. However, instead of 21 ending the sequence, David had mistakenly written 18. It may have a way of him leaving a cryptic message, as when he was a college football player he owned the number 18 jersey. However, as his car was found close to the number 18 mile marker on Highway 80, investigators think it may have been a coded distress signal. Bloodhounds tracked David sent back to Highway 80. However, they stopped at a highway intersection with Interstate 10, which was 13 miles north of where his car was found. While looking through items in it, his parents found a strange business card and a pocketbook Bible. It belonged to a man named Tony Ballesteros. He was interrogated by police, but claims he never met David. He was camping with friends, and it was likely his business card fell out of his pocket onto the ground and was claimed by David while he briefly crossed through the campground on his excursion. David's parents also found a strange note that read. They think the word is in the safe. 6 knives in Rob's room. Yus buys your tea and yus take your chances Halloween. Halloween just happened to be the day that David vanished. To this day, nobody knows what happened to him or why he acted so strangely before he disappeared. On February 23, 1992, 2 hikers discovered David's skeletal remains in the desert near Granite Gap, New Mexico. This is the same area where he left behind several clues before he vanished. Medical records confirmed his identity. Although police have been unable to determine when, how, or why he died, there was no evidence of foul play in his death. According to the medical examiner, there was no apparent trauma to his remains. While some still believe that David met with foul play, police have chalked up his death to dehydration and prolonged exposure to the outdoors, aka death by misadventure. Sadly, David's father passed away in 2008.
Number 2.
Robert's loved ones said that she was interested in learning more about her spirituality in 2000. She was coping with the deaths of both of her parents and had been seriously injured in an automobile accident several years prior to her disappearance. Roberts dropped out of college in Durham, North Carolina during her senior year in 2000 and spent most of her time at Cup O' Joe, a coffeehouse in the city. She wrote poetry and journal entries during the day and was intrigued with the writings of Jack Kerouac, the 1950s beatnik author. One of Roberts' favorite novels was Kerouac's 1958 autobiographical book, Dharma Bums, which was set in the Whatcom County, Washington area. Roberts loved traveling and set out for the Northwest United States on March 9, 2000. She did not share her plans with her loved ones, but did leave a note for her roommate. Roberts stated in the letter that she was not suicidal and mentioned her fascination with Kerouac's writings. Roberts took her kitten, B, and drove her white 1993 Jeep Cherokee with the North Carolina license plate number JVP 2881. Roberts' vehicle was discovered wrecked and abandoned on a logging road in Whatcom County, Washington on March 18, 2000, 9 days after she left North Carolina. The Jeep was located near an embankment off of Mount Baker Highway at the foot of the Cascade Mountains, which is approximately 85 miles north of Seattle, Washington. Authorities discovered a fuel purchase receipt dated during the early morning hours of March 13 from Brooks, Oregon inside Roberts' vehicle. A ticket stub for a March 13 showing of the film American Beauty at the theater in Bellis Fair Mall in Bellingham, Washington was also recovered. Cat food was found inside the Jeep as well. Roberts' guitar, compact discs and checkbook were scattered near the scene. $2,500 was tucked inside a pair of her pants. Blankets had been placed over the vehicle's broken windows, signaling that someone had sought protection from the elements. There was no sign of Roberts or her kitten at the scene, and no evidence of foul play was discovered. A witness told authorities that he and his wife believed they saw Roberts at a Texaco gas station in Everett, Washington, shortly after her vehicle was found abandoned. The man said that the woman appeared to be disoriented and did not recall her identity. He terminated his conversation with investigators before he could provide additional details. Authorities believe his sighting was valid and that the man panicked during the phone call for undetermined reasons. There are several theories as to what may have happened to Roberts. Investigators believe that she may have headed towards Mount Baker Highway after her accident and was possibly picked up by a passing motorist. She may have suffered injuries during the wreck and could have been disoriented, as the witness stated, as a result of her condition. Some people have speculated that an unknown individual was driving Roberts' vehicle at the time of the accident and that foul play may have been involved in her disappearance. There is little evidence to support any theory regarding her whereabouts. Extensive searches of the area around her wreck provided few clues in her disappearance. Roberts was a soccer player during her college years. Her case remains unsolved.
Number 3.
The 2-year-old girl was playing on her family farm in Goaz-al-Ludu, just outside of Brest, in Brittany, France. It was a quiet and safe area, and Pauline Picard's mother never worried about letting her children play in the picturesque farmland. But when she called her daughter to supper one evening in April 1922, she was horrified by the lack of response. Shocked by the little girl's disappearance, police and townspeople banded together to comb the landscape for the lost girl, but they came up empty-handed. La Petite Pauline Picard, as the media dubbed her, had vanished without a trace. Statistics show that the first 48 hours after a child's disappearance are the most critical for finding them alive. So at the 3-week mark, the Picards had begun to abandon hope of ever seeing their little girl again. Little Pauline was widely assumed to have been eaten by a boar or taken by gypsies. So news from Cherbourg of a little girl matching Pauline's description having been found by police seemed miraculous. When an officer showed a photo of the child to Pauline's mother, Le Matin reported that she burst into tears, crying, "That's my daughter. My poor little Pauline." Overcome with joy, the couple drove 250 miles to Cherbourg to take their daughter home. But the story of little Pauline was far from over. Questions quickly grew into a heartbreaking paranoia for the Picards. How had their toddler wandered 250 miles without succumbing to the elements? Why did she not seem to recognize her parents or her brothers and sisters? And, most troublesome, they couldn't understand how she had forgotten the Breton dialect. These doubts were explained away as amnesia brought on by post-traumatic stress. The working theory? That Pauline had been abducted and abused by her kidnapper. While the girl didn't seem to recognize her family, they, including her brothers, sisters and even their neighbors, all recognized her. A mysterious woman dressed in rags was seen with the little girl before she was taken by Cherbourg police, and the media maintained that this woman was the key to unraveling the mystery of Pauline's disappearance. Though newspapers from Paris to New York rejoiced over the miraculous return of little Pauline, the Picards harbored nagging suspicions that the child living in their house was not theirs. These worries grew when a local farmer, Yves Martin, seemingly confessed to killing their daughter. He shakily asked the Picards whether they thought the little girl in the house was their daughter before screaming, "God help me, I'm guilty," and running off. He was later admitted to an asylum. And soon after, a discovery was made that would terrify a nation. On May 26, 1 month after Pauline was discovered in Cherbourg, a cyclist found the naked body of a small girl not far from the Picard farm. The head, feet and hands had been removed, preventing positive identification, but next to it was a neatly folded pile of children's clothes, among which were the black and white checkered dress, navy blue jacket and black tights little Pauline had been wearing the day she disappeared. Stranger still? The skull of a fully grown man was found next to the grisly scene, introducing the prospect of a second victim. Also, the police and volunteer rescue searchers maintained that they had been over the area where the body was found many times. So careful was the search made at the time of Pauline's disappearance that the body would have been discovered had it been lying where it was found, the New York Times reported. All of which suggested that the body had been moved there recently because the killer wanted it to be found. So who was the little girl living with the Picards? Sadly, after the body was found, the Picards determined that the girl found in Cherbourg could not be their Pauline, and she was sent to live in an orphanage. But questions have lingered over the last century as to how the Picards could have been so sure initially that the little girl found 250 miles away was theirs. Experts point out that parents often suffer from a very confusing psychological state after a child's death. When your child dies, the pain and devastation of the loss can feel overwhelming, says Carolyn Bryce, CEO of the Compassionate Friends, a British support group for bereaved parents. The Picards are not the only family to have, in extreme grief, mistaken another child as their own. But lacking DNA evidence to confirm whether the body found in the woods was indeed little Pauline, this tragic mystery remains unsolved.
Number 4.
Like most teenagers in the 1950s, 15-year-old Barbara and 13-year-old Patricia Grimes were obsessed with Elvis Presley. On December 28, 1956, the sisters left their house at 7:30 p.m. with $2.50 between them to go to Brighton Theatre to see the new Elvis Presley movie, Love Me Tender, for the 15th time. Their mother, Loretta Grimes, expected that the sisters would stay later to watch the double feature, and the girls promised to be back home by midnight. Reliable witnesses proved that the girls arrived at the movie theater safely. Dorothy Weinert, a friend of Patricia's, sat behind the girls during the first film. Dorothy left after the first film, but as she was leaving she saw Barbara and Patricia in good spirits and buying popcorn at the concession stand. That was the last time Barbara and Patricia were seen alive. Loretta began to worry when midnight passed and her daughters were still out. Two of the older Grimes children went out to wait for their sisters at the bus stop, and although several buses stopped, Barbara and Patricia did not step out of any of them. By 2 a.m., Barbara and Patricia were still missing, and Loretta called the police. Barbara and Patricia's disappearance prompted Chicago's largest citywide hunt. Hundreds of police officers and civilians worked together to search the city for the girls. Even nearby counties and towns offered help and resources. As news of the sisters' disappearance spread, reported sightings began to come in faster than the police could keep up with them. Some people claimed to have seen the sisters on their way out of Chicago on a bus, and another witness claimed to have seen the sisters listening to Elvis Presley records in a department store. One of Patricia's classmates claimed she received 2 phone calls around midnight about 2 weeks after the girls disappeared and that the voice on the phone sounded like Patricia's. None of the stories proved to be reliable leads, however. Eventually, the police came to the conclusion that the Grimes sisters must have planned their own disappearance and run away to go to Nashville to meet their idol, Elvis. This theory became so popular that Elvis publicly addressed the girls over the radio and pleaded with them to be good Presley fans and go home and ease their mother's worries, according to New York Daily News. Although the police determined Barbara and Patricia must have run away, their mother remained convinced that her daughters would never run away, especially since they had not brought any extra money or clothes with them. Their mother also believed they would not have left behind all of their new Christmas presents, including a brand new AM radio. On January 22, 1957, the search ended. A man named Leonard Prescott was driving along German Church Road on his way to the grocery store when he spotted what he first thought were 2 mannequins on the side of the road. He immediately went back home to get his wife, and they returned to investigate the scene together. Upon closer inspection, the Prescotts realized that the mannequins were really the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and they called the police. The bodies were unclothed and positioned so that Barbara was lying face down with Patricia lying face up and perpendicular on top of her. Their faces were also partially damaged by animals. The police believed the bodies had been there since the snowfall on January 9 and 10, but only just revealed by the recent thaw. The autopsy later revealed that the girls must have died within about 4 hours of going missing, since the dinner they ate at home before they left for the movies was still in their stomachs. The autopsy also showed that neither girl had alcohol in their system before they died, and that Barbara did have sexual relations before she died, although it could not be determined whether it was consensual or not. According to the lineup, the coroner's jury said the cause of death was officially murder, but the only explanation they could come up with was secondary exposure to the elements. My poor babies. Why couldn't they have taken me and let my babies live? If the police had listened to me, they would have had the true story half an hour after the girls were missing," Loretta Grimes said. A funeral for the girls was held on January 28, 1957, at St. Maurice Church, where Patricia attended grade school. The funeral was donated by the Wolschlager Funeral Home and was attended by many, including the mayor of Chicago. Several newspapers reported that Loretta collapsed multiple times during the funeral and was heard sobbing that she was finally reunited with her daughters. The girls were buried in two closed white coffins near their sister, Leona Freck, who had died 2 years before them. Several suspects were apprehended and questioned by the police, but the most publicized suspect was Edward Lee Bedwell, a 21-year-old troublemaking drifter who looked similar to Elvis. The police were more suspicious of him since some witnesses claimed to have seen Barbara and Patricia entering a car or restaurant with a man who resembled Elvis. Bedwell initially offered a 14-page-long confession to the murders, but there was no evidence that he was guilty, and he later recanted his confession, claiming that the police had beat and bribed it out of him. Since there was no concrete evidence against him, the authorities had to set him free. The police promised Loretta that they would never stop looking for the killer of her daughters, but she died with no closure. The murder of the Grimes sisters was also later suspected to be tied to the murder of Bonnie Lee Scott, who was killed about a year after the Grimes sisters. She was 15 years old, and her body was discovered naked like the Grimes sisters. Additionally, all the girls had similar non-lethal marks around their abdomens. According to the lineup, the man responsible for the murder of Bonnie Scott allegedly called Loretta to brag about getting away with the murder of the Grimes sisters and Bonnie Scott. There was also another girl who later claimed that she was abducted with the Grimes sisters when she was 14, but she didn't come forward sooner because she was too scared. Eventually, a man named Charles Leroy Melquist was convicted for the murder of Bonnie Scott, but he was never officially implicated in the Grimes murder. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, but he was released after serving only 11 years. He later married and had 2 children. The murder of the Grimes sisters is known as the murder that caused Chicago to lose its innocence. It officially remains a cold case, but people have not stopped searching for answers about what happened the day Barbara and Patricia were killed.
Number 5.
Wylie was last seen in Hinckley Township, Ohio on July 28, 1985. He has never been heard from again. At 4 a.m. on July 30, his tan 1980 Toyota station wagon was found at Lakefront State Park on Lake Erie in Cleveland, Ohio. The car was locked and contained some clothing, as well as Wylie's wallet, with $15 in cash, credit cards, his police identification and badge, suntan lotion, a beach towel and a pack of cigarettes. An extensive search of the area turned up no sign of him. Authorities initially believed he drowned in Lake Erie, but they have since discounted that possibility. Wylie had told someone he planned to buy a swimsuit and go swimming with an unidentified person from out of town. But Wylie didn't like swimming, and it was later discovered that he'd never bought a swimsuit. Wylie's apartment was left in a very neat condition. It was locked, but a window had been left open. Extra water and several days' worth of food were set out for Wylie's 2 cats. Wylie was writing a novel at the time of his disappearance and often spoke of it. The book was about a homicide in Pennsylvania. Police were unable to locate his manuscript after his disappearance. He had also written a book of poetry, and it, too, disappeared with him. Wylie also took his music collection, envelopes, stamps, typewriter paper and his address book. He typically wore long-sleeved shirts, and most of those were missing from his home. There was nothing inside the refrigerator except a container of mayonnaise. When police picked up his uniforms at the dry cleaners, they found a cab schedule and a bus schedule he had left in the pockets. The top drawer of Wylie's desk at the police station, which normally contained many items, was completely empty, except for his apartment key. Prior to his disappearance, Wylie wrote a letter to a female friend, saying he was tired of his life and wanted to disappear. He said he would be 2,500 miles away by the time his friend got the letter. His friend never received the letter, and investigators never found it, but they deciphered what Wylie had written by looking at the ribbon on his office typewriter. In the weeks before he went missing, he had seemed moody and left work early a lot, which is uncharacteristic of him. His friends believed he was bored with his job. Wylie had said he planned to retire from police work at age 50 and write full-time. He disappeared 3 years before he could do this. Wylie became a police officer in 1966. He joined the Hinckley Township Police Department in 1978 and became police chief in 1982. He had also worked as a fingerprint technician for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, a background investigator for the Department of Defense, an Army intelligence officer, and a newspaper reporter. He has no children and got divorced in 1984 after a 17-year marriage. He was paying his wife alimony. Wylie didn't make any large withdrawals from his bank account before he vanished, and he left behind thousands of dollars in his pension fund. His loved ones stated it would be uncharacteristic of him to leave his car, it was a gift from his deceased brother, and he treasured it. Investigators don't believe Wylie was murdered or committed suicide, they think he staged his disappearance and traveled far away, possibly to California. He was declared legally dead in 1993. His case remains unsolved.
Number 6.
Gardaí admitted that tracing a 30-year-old Toyota Cressida car or its parts now holds the key to solving the mystery of an Irish couple who vanished without trace in 1991. Conor and Sheila Dwyer both vanished from their home in Fermoy, Company Cork, on April 30, 1991, and have not been seen since. Their disappearance remains one of Ireland's most baffling missing persons cases. Despite a major investigation, both Gardaí and the couple's family have been unable to determine their fate. Gardaí stressed that their investigation into the missing couple remains open and active, though it has now been several years since any possible information came to light. But detectives believe tracing their Toyota Cressida car holds the key to the mystery over what happened and urged anyone with information to contact them. The car, a white saloon, had the registration number 5797ZT and has never been found. The Garda investigation was hampered by the fact the couple, both in their 60s, vanished with all their travel documents left at their Chapel Hill home. Their bank accounts were never accessed and, despite numerous appeals, TV reconstructions and even an RTE Acute radio documentary, no confirmed trace of the couple was ever found. The TV reconstruction revolved around a replica Toyota Cressida car which Fermoy Gardaí believe now holds the key to the mystery. A possible sighting was reported in Munich in Germany in 1993, but both Bavarian police and Interpol were unable to confirm it. The German information intrigued Gardaí because Mr. Dwyer, a handyman, had worked for a time in Ireland for a German businessman. Mr. Dwyer ran errands for the businessman and also looked after his cars, including a Rolls-Royce. The file is open but, at this point, we just don't know what happened, a Garda source said. Without any possible sightings to investigate, our best hope is tracing that Toyota Cressida car. Or what might remain of it, such as a license plate or engine block. The last contact anyone had with the couple was on May 1 when Ms. Dwyer spoke to her sister on the phone. The last sighting was by a neighbor near their Chapel Hill home at 9:30 a.m. on April 30 as the couple left to attend a funeral. On May 22 the alarm was raised when Ms. Dwyer's sisters, Macy and Nellie, became concerned at their inability to locate the couple and alerted Gardaí. The disappearance shocked neighbors, friends and family because all had reported nothing unusual with either Conor or Sheila Dwyer. The couple vanished, leaving behind all their personal belongings including photo albums, clothing and even jewelry.
Number 7.
There are many odd stories about people who mysteriously disappeared. The unexplained Nanjing incident is about 3,000 soldiers who vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. What happened to them? How can people just vanish from one spot without any trace? There are some theories that could explain this unusual disappearance, but there are no definite answers that solve this mystery. It should be pointed out right from the start that the disappearance of the soldiers is not related to the Nanjing massacre that took place in 1937. The Nanjing siege was over and resolved by mid-1938, over a year earlier. On December 9, 1939, during the horrors of the Japanese aggression against the Republic of China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937-45, a newly arrived battalion of Chinese soldiers was assigned to a 2-mile stretch of foothills as reinforcements in the area of Nanjing. The commander of the battalion was Colonel Li Fuxian, and the Chinese army was ordered to prevent the Japanese from getting out of the city. Several hours later 3,000 Chinese soldiers were gone without a trace. There were no signs of any battle, and their guns were found stacked beside their cooking fire. With the exception of a handful of troops stationed at the bridge on watch, there was not another single soldier to be seen. Who could an entire army just vanish? One theory is that the Japanese had attacked and dragged the soldiers away, but Colonel Li Fuxian and his aides had not heard any sounds during the night. The few remaining soldiers were questioned, but according to their testimonies, they had not heard any sounds of combat. They had absolutely no idea what could have happened to the missing battalion. Had the Chinese decided to surrender to the Japanese? If they could have had to cross a bridge into the area occupied by the Japanese, and this bridge was under constant observation. Peasants living in the area reported they had not seen anyone crossing the bridge, nor had they had any gunfire. It is unlikely that the soldiers had deserted because there were no hiding places in an area where vegetation was so sparse. 3,000 soldiers would be detected sooner or later, and yet these people were never found. According to reports that came later from the Japanese, they had not engaged any such group of Chinese soldiers in battle during that time. An alternative theory is that the soldiers vanished into a parallel universe. If our reality is surrounded by a number of invisible parallel worlds, isn't it possible for a person to enter one of those unknown realms simply by mistake? If that happens, the person in question would find him or herself in a different reality, probably unable to ever get back to our own world. There are many speculations and no real answers. The fact remains 3,000 soldiers vanished into thin air, and their disappearance remains an unexplained mystery.